6 months after Thomas Blackwood's arrest, Sarah stood outside the federal courthouse in downtown Chicago, watching a steady stream of reporters, attorneys, and affected patients enter the building for what legal experts were calling the most significant healthcare fraud trial in American history. The United States versus Thomas Blackwood et al. Had captivated national attention not just for the scope of the alleged crimes, but for what it represented, a test of whether corporate executives could be held personally accountable for systematic discrimination that affected hundreds of thousands of Americans. Sarah was scheduled to be the prosecution's star witness, the former MetLife adjuster whose discovery of mysterious denial patterns had unraveled a multi-billion-dollar conspiracy to eliminate healthcare coverage for vulnerable populations. "Sarah, are you ready for this?" Robert Kim asked as they walked up the courthouse steps. Over the past 6 months, Robert had become more than just her attorney. He had become a close friend who understood the personal cost of challenging corporate power. "As ready as anyone can be for testifying against a former employer in a federal criminal trial," Sarah replied, adjusting the conservative business suit she had chosen for maximum credibility with the jury. Inside the courthouse, the scene was overwhelming. The largest available courtroom was packed with spectators, media representatives, and family members of patients whose claims had been denied through the priority protocols. Sarah recognized several faces from Elena Vasquez's reporting: families who had lost loved ones due to delayed or denied medical treatment, patients who had suffered unnecessarily because algorithms had determined their lives weren't cost-effective. At the defense table sat Thomas Blackwood and 4 other former MetLife executives, each flanked by teams of expensive attorneys. Blackwood looked remarkably different from the confident CEO, who had held press conferences 6 months earlier. The federal charges and public scrutiny had aged him considerably, and his expensive suits couldn't hide the haunted expression of someone whose carefully constructed world had collapsed. At the prosecution table, Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh was reviewing her notes for Sarah's testimony. Over the past months, Jennifer had become something of a national figure, the federal prosecutor who was taking on corporate healthcare fraud with unprecedented aggressiveness. Judge Patricia Holbrook, a different Patricia Holbrook than the congresswoman who had offered Sarah her advocacy position, called the court to order. This Judge Holbrook was a veteran federal jurist known for her no-nonsense approach to white-collar crime prosecutions. The prosecution may call its next witness. The United States calls Sarah Chen. Sarah walked to the witness stand, aware that her testimony would be broadcast live on multiple news networks, and that millions of Americans would hear her story of discovering and exposing the priority protocol's conspiracy. "Ms. Chen," Assistant U.S. Attorney Walsh began, "please tell the jury about your employment history with Metropolitan Insurance Corporation." For the next hour, Sarah walked the jury through her 12-year career at MetLife, her discovery of the mysterious denial language, her systematic investigation of targeting patterns, and her eventual decision to become a whistleblower despite the personal and professional risks. "Ms. Chen, I want to direct your attention to what has been marked as Government Exhibit 47, an internal memo dated March 15th from defendant Thomas Blackwood. Can you read the highlighted portion for the jury?" Sarah looked at the document she had first seen in Marcus Rivera's Priority Protocols folder. "Our long-term viability depends on achieving optimal customer segmentation. We cannot continue to subsidize healthcare costs for populations that generate negative returns on investment. Priority Protocols represents a sophisticated approach to risk management that will restore our competitive position while maintaining plausible deniability regarding individual claim decisions." "Ms. Chen, in your professional opinion, what did Mr. Blackwood mean by populations that generate negative returns on investment?" He was referring to patients who needed expensive medical care, elderly people with chronic conditions, children with serious illnesses, adults with ongoing treatment needs. The priority protocols were designed to eliminate these patients from coverage by systematically denying their legitimate claims. And Ms. Chen, what did you understand maintaining plausible deniability to mean? It meant disguising systematic discrimination as routine medical necessity determinations. Individual adjusters wouldn't know they were implementing discriminatory policies because the algorithms made it look like normal claims processing. Thomas Blackwood's lead attorney, a renowned white-collar defense specialist named David Morrison, cross-examined Sarah for 3 hours, attempting to portray her as a disgruntled employee who had misunderstood complex business practices and fabricated evidence to support false allegations. Ms. Chen, isn't it true that you were facing performance issues at MetLife before you made these allegations? No, that's not true. My performance reviews were consistently positive, and I had been promoted multiple times. Ms. Chen, isn't it true that you violated MetLife's computer access policies by accessing systems beyond your authorized level? Sarah had prepared for this question with Robert Kim. I accessed systems that were necessary to understand patterns I was seeing in claim denials. When I discovered systematic problems, I reported them to my supervisor as company policy required. Ms. Chen, isn't it true that you shared confidential MetLife information with a journalist without authorization? I shared evidence of systematic discrimination with a journalist because internal reporting had been ignored and patients were being harmed by MetLife's practices. Morrison pressed harder. Ms. Chen, you understand that corporate information is protected by law, regardless of your personal interpretation of that information? I understand that whistleblowing is also protected by law when it exposes systematic harm to vulnerable populations. The exchange continued for hours, with Morrison attempting to characterize Sarah as a criminal who had stolen proprietary information and fabricated evidence, while Sarah consistently explained her actions as necessary steps to expose and stop systematic discrimination. But the prosecution's most devastating evidence came not from Sarah's testimony, but from the parade of patients and family members who testified about the human cost of the priority protocols. Dorothy Martinez, now cancer-free thanks to the chemotherapy coverage she had finally received, testified about the terror of being told her treatment was experimental and the relief of learning that someone had exposed the conspiracy that had nearly cost her life. Emma Rodriguez's parents testified about their 12-year-old daughter's death from preventable diabetes complications, describing how MetLife's denial of continuous glucose monitoring equipment had eliminated the warning system that could have saved their child's life. Marcus Rivera, testifying under immunity, provided detailed insider testimony about how the priority protocols had been developed, implemented, and hidden from adjusters who were unknowingly implementing discriminatory policies. Mr. Rivera, Assistant U.S. Attorney Walsh asked, "Did you understand that priority protocols would result in patient deaths?" Marcus looked directly at Thomas Blackwood. "Yes. We had actuarial projections that estimated mortality rates associated with delayed or denied care. Those projections were treated as acceptable business costs." And Mr. Rivera, who approved those projections? Thomas Blackwood personally signed off on implementation strategies that included mortality estimates as part of our cost-benefit analysis. The trial continued for 3 weeks, with the prosecution presenting overwhelming evidence of systematic discrimination, executive-level conspiracy, and deliberate harm to vulnerable patient populations. The defense strategy of portraying the priority protocols as legitimate business practices crumbled under the weight of internal documents that explicitly discussed eliminating unprofitable patients from coverage. On a gray December morning, the jury returned its verdicts after 18 hours of deliberation. Thomas Blackwood, guilty on all counts, including conspiracy, healthcare fraud, wire fraud, and civil rights violations. The judge immediately sentenced him to 15 years in federal prison and ordered him to pay $2.4 billion in restitution to affected patients. The 4 other MetLife executives received sentences ranging from 8 to 12 years, with additional restitution requirements and lifetime bans from working in the insurance industry. Outside the courthouse, Sarah stood with Robert Kim and Elena Vasquez, processing the magnitude of what had just happened. The corporate executives who had designed and implemented systematic discrimination against vulnerable patients were going to prison, and billions of dollars would be returned to patients whose legitimate claims had been denied. "Sarah, how does it feel to have won?" Elena asked, her recording device capturing what would become Sarah's most widely quoted statement about the entire experience. "It doesn't feel like winning," Sarah replied. "It feels like justice. Emma Rodriguez is still dead. Thousands of patients still suffered unnecessarily. We can't undo the harm that was done, but we can make sure it doesn't happen again. That evening, Sarah and Jamie had dinner at the same Northside restaurant where they had celebrated the federal charges 6 months earlier. But this time, they weren't alone. Dorothy Martinez had joined them, along with Emma Rodriguez's parents, Marcus Rivera and Elena Vasquez. They were celebrating not just the criminal convictions, but the relationships they had built through shared commitment to holding corporate power accountable. "Sarah," Dorothy said, raising her glass in a toast, "you saved my life. But more than that, you saved the lives of people who don't even know your name yet. People whose insurance claims will be approved because you had the courage to expose systematic discrimination." Emma's father, Miguel Rodriguez, added, "Our daughter died because MetLife decided her life wasn't worth the cost of keeping her alive. We can't bring Emma back, but we can make sure other families don't go through what we experienced." Sarah looked around the table at the people whose lives had been forever changed by her decision to investigate mysterious denial patterns in Dorothy Martinez's cancer claim. They had all paid enormous personal costs for challenging corporate power, but they had also achieved something remarkable. They had proven that systematic corporate wrongdoing could be exposed and stopped when ordinary people found the courage to act. 3 months later, Sarah stood before a joint session of Congress as President Jennifer Martinez signed the Healthcare Insurance Reform Act into law. The legislation, directly inspired by the MetLife prosecutions, banned discriminatory denial algorithms, required transparent appeals processes, and created federal oversight mechanisms to prevent systematic targeting of vulnerable patient populations. This law exists because a claims adjuster noticed something that didn't make sense and refused to ignore it, President Martinez said during the signing ceremony. Sarah Chen's courage has protected millions of Americans from systematic discrimination in healthcare coverage. Sarah's new role as Director of Healthcare Advocacy for the Federal Trade Commission had evolved beyond anything she had imagined when she first decided to investigate the priority protocols. She was now leading a team of investigators and attorneys focused on preventing systematic discrimination across the healthcare industry, working with other potential whistleblowers, and helping to build systems that protected patients instead of exploiting them. But the most meaningful part of her new work was the calls she received from insurance company employees who had noticed suspicious patterns in their own companies' practices. Sarah had become a symbol of successful whistleblowing, proving that individual courage could challenge corporate power and win. "Ms. Chen, this is Lisa Park from Aetna. I think I've found evidence of systematic denial patterns similar to what you exposed at MetLife." "Ms. Chen, this is Michael Torres from Blue Cross. Our chronic care division has been implementing new protocols that seem to target expensive patients for claim denials." "Ms. Chen, this is Jennifer Kim from Cigna. I've been documenting demographic patterns in our denial rates that suggest systematic discrimination." Each call represented another potential Sarah Chen, another claims adjuster or medical reviewer who had noticed that something didn't make sense and was considering whether to have the courage to investigate further. Remember, Sarah told each potential whistleblower, "Systematic corporate wrongdoing continues because people assume someone else will take responsibility for stopping it. But sometimes, the person who notices the problem is the person who has to solve it." 1 year after the Priority Protocols conspiracy was exposed, Sarah received a letter that brought her full circle to where her journey had begun. "Dear Ms. Chen, my name is Maria Santos, and I am a 67-year-old grandmother with diabetes. Last month, my insurance company tried to deny coverage for insulin pump therapy using language that seemed familiar from news coverage of your case. Instead of accepting the denial, I appealed the decision and referenced the Healthcare Insurance Reform Act that was passed because of your courage. My appeal was approved within a week. Ms. Chen, I am writing to thank you for showing me that I don't have to accept systematic discrimination from my insurance company. Because you had the courage to fight MetLife, I had the knowledge and confidence to fight for my own medical care. Your courage gave me courage. With gratitude, Maria Santos." Sarah sat in her FTC office, reading Maria Santos's letter and thinking about the ripple effects of individual courage. Her decision to investigate Dorothy Martinez's denied cancer claim had not only exposed a multi-billion-dollar conspiracy, it had inspired countless other people to question, investigate, and challenge systematic wrongdoing in their own lives. The battle against corporate discrimination was far from over. But Sarah Chen had proven that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they refused to accept that systematic harm was simply, quote, how business works. Outside her office window, Washington, D.C. continued its daily rhythm of political negotiations and policy debates. But inside her office, Sarah was already reviewing the next case, the next potential conspiracy, the next opportunity to hold corporate power accountable to the people it was supposed to serve. The work continued because protecting vulnerable people from systematic discrimination was never finished. It was simply passed from one generation of courageous individuals to the next.